drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a Ph.D. in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Background is?
Sure. So my background is that, well, I guess I should start with where I am now. So I'm an associate professor of neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. And I'm also a visiting professor of psychology at Princeton University. My background is that I am interested in how the brain is affected by the foods that we eat. And I started off on this journey when I was a grad student at Princeton. I went there for my Ph.D. to study neuroscience and learn about the brain. And our lab since then has been focused on this idea of food addiction and trying to better understand our modern food environment and how the different foods that we engage with these days are affecting our brains in ways that are perhaps not good for our health and can be contributing to addictive overeating. So that's essentially what we've been looking at and thinking about in my lab and what I pretty much think about all the time.
Okay, so when we talk about addiction, it's a subject I've covered before on the podcast, but, for those who haven't learned too much about this, maybe let's start with drug addiction and then talk about the extent to which, there is such a thing as food addiction and foods, do or do not behave like addictive drugs do. So from the standpoint of an addiction biologist, when we think about drugs of addiction, right, what is addiction? How do you define it and what characterizes it?
Yeah, it's an important question. And I spent a lot of time, especially early in my career, looking at that very question, because when we think about what it is an addiction, we have criteria that we can apply. So the American Psychiatric Association, in their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, lays out the criteria that need to be met for what's referred to as substance use disorder. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a spectrum. So you can have mild, moderate, or severe substance use disorder. And so depending on what your substance is, that may or may not be terrible, right? So obviously if you have, a major substance use disorder for something like heroin, it's going to potentially cause you to, overdose, and you're going to have a lot of problems. It's an illegal substance. But if you have, major addiction to caffeine and you're just drinking coffee all day long, then maybe it's not going to be so bad. So it really depends on the substance and the severity of the substance. So what we've been doing essentially is taking these criteria for addiction, and there's a variety of different categories of criteria. Some of them are, based off of the way in which the substance works in our bodies. So, whether or not you experience tolerance to the substance, whether or not you experience withdrawal signs if you go off the substance. But some of them are also social constructs. So, some of the criteria for addiction are built around whether or not, you could miss work because you're using the substance. And obviously you could bring coffee to work, so you don't have to miss work to use coffee or caffeine, but you can't bring other things, to work all the time that maybe people are addicted to. So the criteria, again, there's room for discussion there, I think. I think those could be better defined, but that's another topic. But in any case, how does food fall into this? What we've been doing is basically taking those criteria, and we've conducted experiments, both preclinical and clinical, to basically just test whether or not ultra-processed foods, or sugar in particular, can produce those criteria that are associated with addiction. And, much like there's plenty of drugs out there that aren't addictive, there's plenty of foods out there that aren't addictive. But what we've been finding is that the foods that are considered ultra processed foods that have excess amounts of sugar in them seem to fall into this category where the DSM criteria for addiction can be met when the substance of abuse is that food.
Mm-hmm. So, when we think about addiction, we can think about it behaviorally. We can look at what animals or humans do in response to consuming certain substances. People often talk about, dependency and compulsion. Dependency basically being in the absence of the thing that you're addicted to, there's some kind of withdrawal symptoms. You feel bad because you've become dependent on it. And then compulsion being, how strong is the pull to consume the thing? Will you want to go consume it even at the expense of doing other things that are, normal or adaptive in your life? And then, the other way we can think about this, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is the actual effects on the brain. How do different parts of the brain light up? What are the mechanisms involved in response to consuming certain substances that are addictive? And how does food look in comparison to drugs of addiction? So when we think about this behaviorally, in terms of what animals do, the compulsion, the dependency side of things, can you start off by just talking a little bit about what are some of the clearest examples of a food that drives addictive behaviors akin to what we see with addictive drugs?
Yeah, so in terms of the behavior, which is very important because that kind of lays the groundwork for further exploration in terms of the brain mechanisms. What we've seen is many of the behaviors that you would see in animal models where an animal is, dependent on alcohol, for example, there's certain behaviors, seeking behaviors that they'll engage in that we also can see happening with sugar. So, again, things like building up a tolerance. So needing to consume more and more of the substance in order to get the same euphoria or satisfaction that you used to get from having less of it. That's certainly one of the behaviors that we've seen. Also, like I mentioned a bit earlier, withdrawal. If the substance is not available for a period of time, then we are able to see both clinically and preclinically signs of withdrawal emerging. And what this looks like when it comes to food is similar to what it looks like with tobacco or what it looks like with caffeine, where, depending on, the severity of the dependence, people can experience feelings of irritability. People might feel weak or lethargic. And again, it's going to vary depending on the individual and, how much of the substance they've been consuming and for how long. And then in terms of cravings, that's also another behavior that we've been able to capture in terms of the research. We've seen that in animal models, animals are willing to work harder for longer in order to get access to a substance like sugar or ultra processed food. And that's similar to what you would see if an animal was dependent on nicotine or, on morphine even,
Mm-hmm.
where they're willing to lever press, 5,000 times in order to get a little hit of it. Whereas if it was a different substance, it wouldn't be worth it, right? So they wouldn't even bother lever pressing to get access to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that willingness to work is a key, because even though we're seeing this in animal models, we also can see it in humans as well, in the sense that people will articulate to us that they crave certain types of foods. People don't typically say, oh, I'm craving, broccoli. But, when they are, especially in an emotional dysregulated state, like stressed or anxious, they tend to experience a desire for foods that will
Mm-hmm.
satisfy them. And again,
Mm-hmm.
that's related to the brain
Yeah.
mechanisms.
And I suppose a key thing here is that we see, whether it's the dependency and withdrawal side of things or the compulsion, the seeking side of things, you're seeing this behavior, it sounds, in for certain foods and not others. And by analogy, we see this type of thing for certain drugs, but not others. Animals will work very hard and exhibit cravings for cocaine at a rate that's much higher than, say, LSD or whatever.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's where it gets tricky, because a lot of this, in hindsight, it's one of those things where you are regretful of calling something something, right? Because when we first started publishing about this work, we were using the term food addiction because we were looking at food and seeing that some of it's addictive. But what's happened now is that, not all food is addictive.
Mm-hmm.
So, the terminology has morphed a bit, and some scientists will talk about ultra processed food addiction, which I guess is a better way to characterize it, although it's kind of a mouthful. But one thing that I kind of think, and perhaps we could get into this in a few minutes, that is almost a solution that would help a lot of this would be if we had a different category for these different types of foods. I don't necessarily think the term food should be this ubiquitous
Hmm.
umbrella that encompasses everything from carrots to Pop-Tarts, because
Right, right.
there are very big differences between those things. So that's where I'd like to see some changes in terms of how we think about this from the addiction side for sure, but we also need to think about, well, what is a food?
Hmm. And one thing I want to address up front for listeners too is um, when we talk about addiction, even if we're talking about drug addiction, a drug can be highly addictive. That doesn't mean everyone who's exposed to it becomes addicted. Even highly addictive drugs, like say cocaine, only usually a minority of individuals in a population, whether it's rats or mice, whether it's humans, will actually become compulsive drug seekers after multiple rounds of consumption. And so I just kind of want to say this up front when we think about food, because, a lot of people will say, well, sugar can't be addictive. No, I don't know anyone who's addicted to sugar. I eat sugar. I don't have a problem with it. But I think an important thing to emphasize here is if something is addictive or has an addiction liability, that does not mean that everyone exposed to it will become a compulsive seeker of it.
Absolutely. And, just like people can occasionally, smoke cigarettes or occasionally drink alcohol, then just not consume it. It's the same with food. And I think part of the issue, though, that we see with food and not with things like drugs and alcohol is that we know where the drugs and alcohol are, right? You know, when you go in your refrigerator, if you grab a beverage, whether or not it has alcohol in it, and you can
Yep.
have control over that. Um, if there was little bits of tobacco, and nicotine sprinkled in, everything that we eat, then I have a feeling a lot more people would be addicted to nicotine
Hmm.
because they're consuming it unknowingly. That's what's happening with sugar.
Right.
So when you look at our food supply, when you look at the processed food, which we are reliant on, there aren't enough farms to feed all the people. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have processed food, but when we look at the ingredients, there is sugar in so many of these food products, and the vast majority of them. And often people are consuming it and they don't even realize it.
Yeah.
And so I do think that what does make sugar different from the addiction standpoint is that more people are at risk for getting that addiction or developing that addiction just simply due to, the
Yeah.
fact that they're exposed to it so much more than other drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, the sugar's often, effectively camouflage. There's not necessarily a big label that says this much added sugar. And I'm sure we'll get into some of
Yeah.
the tricky techniques that are used to sort of hide the true amount of sugar and things. Before we get into some of that, I want to talk about let's talk about sugar addiction and the evidence supporting that it is in fact can be addictive. But when you say sugar, what exactly do you mean? Are you talking mostly about glucose, fructose? Does it depend? How do we start to unpack that?
You know, I when I talk about sugar, I'm mostly talking about pretty much anything that's sweet, to be honest. We started off looking at sucrose as the primary sweetener that we were studying, but we've looked at other sweeteners, high fructose corn syrup, and pretty much all the other ones that are out there. And what we're finding from the research is that it's the sweet taste that seems to be driving that addiction-like response.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when we do studies, and we've done lots of studies looking at the brain, what we see happening is that when sugar is consumed, it can release dopamine in the nucleus accumbens and other areas of the limbic system that is the same pattern of release you'd expect to see with something like a drug or alcohol. And you don't typically see that with food. Normally, when an animal eats something, it doesn't release dopamine in the brain. It will if it's a novel food and it's the very first time you've ever tasted that particular type of ingredient or that particular cuisine, because it's more of an orienting response where,
Mm.
it's a survival mechanism. We're kind of built to be wary of new tastes
Yeah.
because when we evolved, it meant if you tasted something funny, it could kill you.
Mm-hmm.
So you better
But there
make
is an
sure you.
aha moment for animals. We're like, I can eat that. It is okay.
Yes. So what's interesting though is that, when we look at the brain, yet most foods don't release dopamine, but when we look at sugar, it does. And it's interesting because often does depend too on the amount of sugar that's being consumed. When
Yeah.
we're looking at a bolus of sugar being consumed, that's going to release dopamine, whereas, occasional sips of sugar here and there don't have that effect on the dopamine system. So it's almost like we've used the term binging. I've gotten away from that because there's such clinical ties to the term binging. It's just really excessive consumption of sugar that causes this dopamine release. And that's what's happening, for most people most of the time, is that they're releasing dopamine in response to eating those cookies or eating, whatever the substance might be that they're eating. And so I think that's really, a big issue that we need to keep in mind in terms of the fact that, these foods are affecting the brain in this way. And it doesn't stop at dopamine. I mean, we've seen changes in the endogenous opioid system, the endocannabinoid system, again, all of which basically parallel what happens when you look at the brains of animals that are addicted to drugs or alcohol.
Hmm. And so if you put animals in a paradigm, the same paradigm you put them in to assess the addiction liability of a drug,
Mhm.
they exhibit the same basic behaviors in response to sugar. Can you just give us like a concrete example of that?
Yeah. So, are you talking about from like the neuroscience standpoint or from the behavioral standpoint?
Well, let's take them one at a time, but starting with the behavior.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, when we do our studies, like I'll tell you, we started off looking at we had to develop an animal model to study this, first of
Hmm.
all, because when I started doing this work, it was the year 2001. And I had just joined the lab at Princeton, and I was talking with my advisor at the time about what we might study. And, just through some discussions, this kind of came to be, to ask the question, well, could food be addictive, just like drugs and alcohol are addictive? And it came out of the fact that obesity, we were starting to hear more and more about it in the media as a public health concern. And, to me, it just didn't seem that it could all be about personal responsibility and it could all be about, willpower, which was kind of what the mantra was back then. And looking at our changing food environment, we started to kind of see, well, there's a lot more sugar in our environment than there was 30 years ago. And now there's a lot more obesity than there was 30 years ago. So perhaps that has something to do with it. So when we developed this animal model, we basically wanted to assess, whether or not binging, withdrawal, and craving, which are kind of like the triad of behaviors associated with addiction, would emerge in response to animals that are just binging or given daily access to large amounts of sugar.
Hmm.
And so we gave them a sugar solution. They always had water to drink too, so they were never forced to drink it for hydration. They always had food available, so they were never forced to consume it just for nutrients. And what we ended up seeing was that, in fact, the animals that had this extended access to the sugar solution would develop binging. They developed signs of tolerance. So, they would have larger binges throughout the day. They'd also show signs of withdrawal. And this was measured using measures of depression. We also used the elevated plus MEs to assess anxiety. And we also had somatic indications that we were assessing, like, changes in blood pressure, changes in body temperature, and even just like ultrasonic vocalizations of distress, essentially,
Hmm.
that they can make to each other that we can pick up using different devices. And then lastly, the craving part that really, can be measured in animals. Even though they can't tell us they're craving something, we can do different experiments to see how hard they're willing to work to
Hmm.
get access to a substance. And that's usually an indicator that they're craving. So we used upward conditioning to do that. And, essentially what happens is that, we're able to demonstrate these behaviors in animals that are having this excessive consumption of sugar, but not in animals that are eating regular rat chow or animals that are having sugar just occasionally.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess one of the keys here is that, you said they always had access to plain water, they always had access to other food, so they can opt in to doing this. And even though they
Yes.
have that option, and it's not necessary for them to hit their nutrient or water requirements, they often will choose to do this, and the binging becomes more frequent. It becomes bigger, and you can essentially measure things like a mouse sugar hangover.
Yeah, basically that's what we've been doing. And, also in people too, because there's been some scales that were developed and ways in which a lot of the work that we started off doing in our animal models could then be translated into humans. And so many of these things can now, and again, with the use of neuroimaging techniques, we can basically see this happening in humans as well. And I think one of the things that, for me is so exciting is that we're able to, capture a lot of what's happening in the brain, because a lot of times behaviors, yes, they are indicative of what's going on in the brain, but to be able to really see these neurochemical changes happening in real time, because a lot of the techniques that we were using at the time of these initial studies were in vivo microdialysis techniques. So that basically allows us to cannulate the rat in the brain and extract extracellular fluid while the animal is awake and moving. So they're basically running around the cage tethered so that we can collect the sample from their brain, and they're eating, they're drinking, they're, engaging in whatever behavior they like. And so to be able to see the rat drinking sugar and then look over on the screen and see a spike in dopamine, I mean, it's really telling to see that happen.
Yeah. So basically, you see all these behavioral signs that the animal is in fact becoming dependent or engaged in compulsive behavior. And then you're saying basically what you've said so far is that you can see in the brain that the consumption of sugar by rodents is eliciting the same types of effects in the same parts of the brain that you would see in response to an addictive drug.
Yep, absolutely. And, when you say it like that, it kind of sounds like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I have to tell you, when we first were doing these initial studies, like when I was a, early grad student and I would go to conferences and present some of our new stuff, it wasn't well received. And it was really just, it's really been over the past, I'd say 10 years or so, that this concept has really gained a lot of traction. And I think, again, it has to do with the fact that, we used to silo things so much. Like addiction was over here, obesity was over here, and nobody really put the two together. But I think now we've gotten a bit more integrated in our thinking when it comes to medicine. And, now like addiction medicine is something that people can become certified in. And, apply that to obesity and apply that to, treating individuals who are struggling with their body weight. So I do think that, we need to keep in mind that, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of changes that have happened that have, I think, allowed us to gain more acceptance, and hopefully that'll continue.
And so in the experiments you've described for animals, are we talking about, when you say sugar water, are you talking about sucrose here?
Yeah, so our studies initially, and again, because we were trying to be careful scientists, we wanted to make sure that when we were using this model to test all these different aspects of substance use disorder or addiction, that we were keeping things aligned. So we were using typically a 10% sucrose solution. And that's about the concentration that you would get of sugar in a can of soda if you were to have one. So that was where we started. And like I said, we've kind of looked at other sweeteners, and we've published looking at high fructose corn syrup. We've looked at glucose. At the end of the day, it really does seem to boil down to that sweet taste. One of the studies that we did, we used sham feeding combined with in vivo microdialysis. So what we did was we cannulated the stomach of the rat so that when they would drink the sugar solution, they wouldn't digest it. It would simply exit through the stomach, through a tube. And when we were to do microdialysis on those animals while they were sham feeding sugar, so they could drink it, taste it, but not digest it, we saw that it was causing a release of dopamine, even though they're not digesting it. So just simply tasting the sugar was enough to elicit that dopaminergic response. And even with other sweeteners that have been tested, the whole sweetener world is a little tricky when it comes to rodents, because some rodents don't even detect the taste of certain artificial sweeteners just because they're so artificial. They
they don't have like receptors for it.
Yeah, they know to stay away. But yeah, so to me, it's really more about the sweet taste. Now, it goes beyond the addiction, right? I mean, obviously there's certain types of sweeteners, like fructose is going to have more of a negative impact on the liver than, maybe other types of sweeteners would. So there are differences for sure in terms of how these sweeteners affect the body. But, just coming from the addiction piece, it's really about the sweet taste.
But yeah, so what you're saying is if you sort of regress all the variables here, it's the level of sweetness is proportional to the level of seeking that you're going to get from the animal.
Absolutely. And, I think that's when we look at this from the public health perspective, I mean, that's the problem is the level of sweetness has just been slowly getting ticked up. And if you look at the amount of sugar that's in all the different food products that are on the market, it's so much more now than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, going
Hmm.
back, you can really see it. And then just the sheer number of products that have added sugar has gone up. So, there's just, I like to think about this from, what are we going to see in 20 years? Because I mean, there's sugar in so many of the different things that kids are eating.
Hmm.
They're basically being raised to have this high level preference for sugar that, basically means that they're going to desire to have things be really, really sweet. So it means they're going to be consuming more and more of it over time.
Yeah. And, one of the things I want to ask about here too is, well, if I step back for a second, I think about sort of why all of the biology is set up this way and, how things work under naturalistic or ecological scenarios. If I think about addictive drugs, it's pretty easy to think about. It's like, okay, the brain needs to have mechanisms to motivate the animal to do things. It needs to have natural forms of reward processing to tell it like, go for this, don't go for that, develop preferences, develop motivations. And it's not surprising that, you see substances like synthetic compounds that have supersized effects in this natural reward circuitry in the brain, whether that's a psychostimulant or an opioid or something. You're like, oh, okay, it's tapping into natural mechanisms that are for reward learning, but it's got a supersized effect effectively because it's not ever anything that an animal is going to encounter in nature.
Right.
And when it comes to something like sugar is of course something that animals encounter in nature. And so, but they're still developing these addictions, as you've just told us. Is the way to think about this that in nature, the dose and the frequency with which an animal will encounter something like a natural sugar reward is limited, whereas in artificial settings concocted by humans, that's not the case?
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you think about it, if an animal or even us as humans, if we were to wander into an apple tree, right? Are you going to eat the whole tree worth of apples? No, we have satiety mechanisms built in where, there's fiber in the apples and we get full from the calories. And so our jaws get tired from having to masticate the apple to chew it up.
Hmm. Hmm.
So we have these sort of built-in brakes, if you will, to slow us down, to stop us from over consuming. So that limits the amount of sugar that we have. And also just nature in and of itself. I mean, the world isn't covered in apple trees. You have to find one. It has to be during the proper season. It has to be, something where the apple hasn't fallen off the tree and it hasn't spoiled. It has to still be, safe and attached to the tree and,
Hmm.
something that you
You
should
have to do
eat.
work to find it. You might have to fight for it. You've got to chew
Yeah.
it. It's not a liquid bolus of straight sugar.
Exactly. And I think that's, really what we're facing right now is that, a lot of the work is taken out. I mean, again, it's wonderful that we have refrigeration and we don't have to, plant our own apple trees, but it does mean that, we get access and the amounts of it, I think, in terms of taking an apple, let's say, and then, making apple juice. Yeah, you can, how many apples would you need to make a glass of apple juice, right? I mean, that's quite a few apples. No one's going to sit there and eat all those
Hmm.
apples. But again, we're bypassing a lot of the barriers that biology has put in place, whether it's from nature or whether it's just from, satiety mechanisms when we take a look at a lot of these processed foods. And that's what makes them so easy to overconsume. And that's what makes it, very dangerous. We weren't designed to have that much sugar. Our bodies, again, were built differently, and have not been able to adapt to have the ability to put on the brakes when it comes to these processed foods, just because it's come on the scene so quickly.
Hmm. Yeah, and yeah, I think this is important. There's a lot of different satiety mechanisms that come into play at different time scales, but in nature, these things are sort of all stacked on top of each other in a way that we've just gotten around through being able to engineer our own foods. And I think it's important to really emphasize this. One of my biggest pet peeves that certain types of people bring up in this discussion is, people will sort of cherry pick from the ethnographic record. They'll say, well, what about the Hadza people? They eat 60% of their calories from honey.
Mhm.
blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, yes, but they also have to climb a tree and then fight off bees to get the honey. They eat it with the waxes and the larvae, and it's seasonal. So there's always baked in limitations.
Right, exactly. And, again, I think we also need to keep in mind, like, yes, what we're eating is important, but like you're suggesting, there's a lot of other stuff that contributes to, um, you know, stressors in our environment that, can lead us to then want to overeat sugar. That's one of the key components I think that often doesn't get discussed. We have a lot of other things that contribute to, what we eat and how that's going to have an impact on our body. If you're an ultra marathon runner, like you probably could get away with eating more sugar and having a lot of these things compared to somebody who maybe is very sedentary or just has a regular office job and doesn't really get that much exercise. So it's all like you said. Yeah, I do not like the cherry picking either because it leaves out the whole like holistic aspect of this, that there's interconnected components that we need to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. And I guess this relates to the question, a sort of a similar question that I often see out there in the yeah in the zeitgeist here, which is sometimes people will make the argument glucose can't possibly be bad for you, sugar can't possibly be bad for you because all organisms are evolved to use glucose as a fuel source. It's an efficient substrate for ATP production, so it can't be bad for you in any context.
Yeah, I've heard that. And, anything could be, I mean, that's like saying like if you just keep putting gasoline in your car until it's covered, leaking out, that how could that be bad for your car? Well, yeah, that's just because the car was only designed to hold a certain amount of gasoline. Same with our brains and our bodies when it comes to sugar. I really don't think we were designed to, have products that we're consuming that have, 50 or 60 grams of sugar in one serving. You're never going to find that in
Yeah,
nature.
every day, all year.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I think we need to keep in mind that, yes, our body uses glucose as a fuel, but our body can make glucose as a fuel. We don't need to eat it in order for our body to make it. And so I think that, there is a bit, I think, of miscommunication out there around actually how much sugar we need to survive. There's plenty of people who really hardly eat any sugar. Look at all the people who do like hardcore keto, for example. They might not be consuming carbohydrates in a meaningful way, but they're still alive and walking around because their body is going to produce the glucose for them. Now, I'm not advocating, that as a long-term solution, but it just proves the point that,
Yeah,
you don't need glucose in order to survive because I think that,
you don't
or
need to
need it,
eat it.
you don't need to
Yeah,
eat it.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And you certainly don't need to eat, 50 grams per serving of it.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I want to talk about here, we'll get into things like individual differences between the response to sugar consumption and say obese versus non-obese people. But I guess sort of the larger point here is if we look at the drug addiction literature, what we find again, as we said before, only a subset of individuals will end up becoming addicted and displaying all the hallmarks of addiction after exposure. Some won't display those things even after exposure. And even when you look at the initial brain response, the very first encounter with an addictive substance like cocaine, say, some individuals will have bigger responses in some of this dopamine reward circuitry than others. And for reasons that are still mysterious, we don't really know where those differences arise, but there are differences between people that will just make one person more prone to have a rewarding response to something, whether it's a natural reward or a drug reward, than other people will. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about individual variability here, maybe brain
Yeah.
responses and the obese versus non-obese individuals, things like that.
Yeah, so genetics certainly plays a role. We know that, certain people just have a genetic propensity to become dependent on things compared to others who maybe perhaps don't have that genetic propensity. Another thing that I think is important to keep in mind, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, is the stress component. Um, Sometimes stress can be the sort of thing that pushes people over to utilize a substance in order to combat stress or to combat anxiety. And so people who, for some reason, have, the less of an ability to manage stress or to cope with stress or have coping skills that have been employed to help them mitigate their anxiety and stress are at greater risk for developing an addiction and utilizing these types of substances like drugs or alcohol. And then, I think individually, when we think about, why some people get addictions versus why others don't, I think we also need to keep in mind history. So ACEs scores, that's adverse childhood experiences. There's a lot of research that suggests that individuals who have higher ACEs scores are more likely to develop addictions. So, acknowledging that there is embedded trauma that can then manifest itself later in life, and sometimes that takes the form of developing an addiction. So I think all of these things, we can easily think about when it comes to addictions to drugs. And I also too think that in many cases, these apply to food. But what's again different, I will argue, is that I guess because of the availability of sugar and because of the early exposure to sugar, more and more people are at risk for developing that addiction. Also, one thing that we should also bring up is this idea of cross-sensitization. And so if you have a history of drug use, you're more likely to get dependent on a new drug.
Because they all tap into the same core mechanism.
Exactly. So that's why, people, will sometimes like warn their teenagers like, oh, don't, if you smoke marijuana or if you smoke cigarettes, you're more likely to then, get into harder drugs later on, this whole like gateway effect idea. And there's some truth to that because again, you're, activating the brain reward system with these substances. And at some point that might max out, or someone might say, oh, let me try this other substance for something different. And then, it goes from there.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
yeah, and people get really strong opinions when it comes to this stuff. But I think what you just said is what is incontrovertibly true is that any substance that can be abused will ultimately tap into the same dopamine-based reward circuitry within the brain, and that circuitry itself becomes more sensitized with and develops tolerance to any one of these substances, and that can lead to a future increase in the likelihood of being sensitized to another one if you engage in consumption of that other thing.
Absolutely. And I've talked with I gave a presentation to Drug Free America Foundation a bit ago, and one of the things that they wanted me to speak about was they have done a really good job of educating people about the dangers of drug use. But a problem that they face is that often people stop using drugs and develop obesity and end up overeating and end up having diabetes. This is something you see happening, just on a smaller scale with people who are smokers who stop smoking.
Yeah.
They usually eat late. And, part of that is because the brain has been sensitized to still want that reward. And since you're not getting it from nicotine or drugs,
you naturally seek to get it somewhere else.
You can get it from sugar. You can get it from processed food. And it's safer than the drug that they were abusing. At least that's, I guess, the way they view it. It's acceptable. It's ubiquitous. It's cheap. And it's, not viewed as necessarily something that is bad for their health. And so, that again underscores this whole concept of how cross-sensitization does play a role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wonder, so when we talk about the palatability of foods and the potential addictive effects that things like sugar can have, how does this tie into things like the obesity epidemic at large? So I would imagine, when most people consume sugar, it's usually not just straight sugar. They're not just taking a scoop full of sucrose. They're not drinking literally a bottle of high fructose corn syrup. It's really these sugars added into other things. And so to the extent that palatability is higher due to the presence of the sugar, to the extent that they become addicted, basically, they're going to naturally be consuming more overall calories, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that sugar is sort of the siren that lures people in, right? It's the thing that is it's the tasty component to the substance that's being consumed. But with that comes additional calories. With
Hmm.
that comes other ingredients that are added that maybe in and of themselves aren't necessarily like desirable or palatable, but they contain things that are going to add extra calories or add saturated fat or add, things that aren't going to be healthful for us.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. It's not sugar that, but I think we need to keep in mind that, we're designed to have like a threshold of sweetness. And so children's threshold for sweetness is actually higher than adults. And so that's why kids' cereals tend to have lots of sugar added on them. And kids always want things to be sweet because they are actually living in a very different sensory world than adults are. The threshold for sweetness of what they prefer is higher than adults.
Hmm.
And, it just goes to show, though, that, it has to be calculated in such a way that it's palatable. It's kind of like an inverted U in the sense that there is this sort of optimal bliss point of sweetness. If you go below that, it doesn't taste that great. If you go above that, it's going to taste aversive. So things can be too sweet. And so that's why it is usually sugar added with other ingredients so that it's not just like 100% sugar that's doing
Hmm.
this.
Hmm. Yeah, because I would imagine naturally, if it wasn't an inverted U relationship, if it was truly linear, like more sweetness equals more consumption, then all of the food companies would simply be putting hundreds and hundreds of grams in everything.
Yeah, we would be investing in the Domino Sugar Company, right? Because
Yeah.
people would just be, popping sugar cubes all day, and no
Hmm.
one is really doing that. But it is, yeah, there is sort of this, but it's creeping up, and I think that's the thing. And I think what we are seeing is that, the increasing amount of eating occasions that are happening does contribute to this as well. So if people are eating, boluses of sugar that maybe they don't realize in terms of the portion size or, just in terms of the other ingredients that are in the product multiple times throughout the day for many years, over time, that's really going to add up and have a negative impact on their health.
Hmm. So we've talked about how sweetness is sort of a major component here. It's really the sweetness. People are attracted to different sugars, have different levels of sweetness, but ultimately, we can more or less think about this in terms of the if something has an optimal level of sweetness, it's going to be maximally reinforcing.
Mhm.
Um, but other foods are also very tasty. I love the taste of many high fat foods that are very low in sugar. I love the taste of very savory foods. There's few things I like more than the right cut of steak.
Mhm.
Um, how come we don't hear about those things driving this kind of compulsive seeking behavior?
I think it has to do with the fact that, again, when we talk about things like, for example, steak, it's processed in the sense that, yeah, you usually cook it a little bit, right, to make sure it's safe to eat. But it's, I think, more about the number of ingredients and, the ultra processed nature. Also, there's, again, going back to what we were talking about a bit ago, we have these satiety signals that are built in. When you consume a steak, you have to chew it, you got to cut it up, it's going to cause you to feel full after you eat it. And we see that isn't really happening with these processed foods, with the foods with added sugar, because most of them do not have a lot of fiber in them. And there's really nothing that's causing us to want to stop eating them. There's no barrier that is put in place to have people, basically become satiated. And, if you think about this sort of like balance of, desire for reward and satiety, usually, when you get some satisfaction, you have satiety going up, and that's kind of allows you to, sit back and enjoy it, and then, maybe get some more later on if you get hungry again or want more reward. But if you have desire with no satiety mechanism in place, there's nothing to stop people from just consuming until it's gone. And
Mhm.
I think that's what's happening with a lot of these sugary foods, and a lot of these highly processed foods that have added sugar. And that makes them different from things that are still delicious and savory, like you say, but perhaps in a very different way.
Mhm. Are there any measurable differences between caloric sweeteners and non-caloric sweeteners in terms of how reinforcing they are?
Well, we have looked at this a bit, and again, it goes back to the sweet taste. And so to me, because people will often say, well, if I just use a non-caloric sweetener, is that going to solve all my problems? And I'll say, well, it might save you some calories, but it's not going to solve your addiction to sugar because it's the sweet taste that's driving the addiction-like response. So when we have these non-caloric sweeteners, the brain doesn't know that it's not a caloric sweetener. The brain actually, I think, probably gets confused by the fact that, hey, I just had this sweetener, but I didn't get any calories. So what's going on here, right? So it, if anything, I think causes there to be some dysregulation in terms of the way in which our brain processes the signal of sweetness in terms of the reaction that typically happens of it containing calories. And over time, what the research has shown is that, in fact, people who use those non-caloric sweeteners, especially if they're obese or overweight, they're more likely to be consuming more food later on. So you might save yourself, 100 or 200 calories by having a diet soda right now, but at the end of the day, you'll end up consuming more overall in terms of calorie intake. So I don't necessarily see them as beneficial for most people, especially for those who are trying to, deal with an addiction to sugar because it's still activating the dopamine system in the same way.
hmm Yeah, I could even imagine, based on my knowledge of the reinforcement literature, if you decouple, so if you've got a non-caloric sweetener, you've got the sweetness, you've got that taste, but you don't have the calories behind it, you're creating sort of a mismatch. I could imagine basically the dopamine reward circuitry tuning down its response such
Mhm.
that if and when you do get a caloric sweetener in the future, now it's that signal is actually going to be boosted later.
Yeah, because the reward in many ways for our body is the calories, right? We need the calories. And I think that is what happens is that, we're causing these issues to arise later on.
hmm Um, can you actually like in animal models, can you actually block the reinforcing effects pharmacologically like you would by, using like an opioid receptor antagonist or a dopamine receptor antagonist or things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could do that chemically by applying drugs locally that block the dopamine receptors or opioid receptors. Um, and that's certainly one way in which, you can assess the, aspects of reward. We haven't done much of that. We've looked at, ways in which we could precipitate withdrawal. And interesting, when we first started publishing some of our earlier studies, we were looking at dopamine, we were looking at other neurotransmitters, but we were also looking at mu opioid receptor binding. And so we wanted to see whether or not there was an increase in receptor binding for opioids in response to consuming sugar. And this has been shown in response to using opiate drugs. And we did see that. We have seen increases in opiate receptor binding. What's interesting is that if we give animals naloxone, which is an opioid receptor antagonist, we can precipitate withdrawal. So we can have an animal that's just, drinking sugar, give them naloxone, and they'll start to tremor, wet dog shakes. They'll
Hmm.
start to show these somatic indications of withdrawal. So, I think that's interesting because, if you just take naloxone and you're not addicted to an opiate, it's not going to do anything to you. That's why it's safe to, Narcan anybody you want because
hmm
it's not going to harm them. But the fact that, sugar can affect the endogenous opioid system in a way that a drug like naloxone can precipitate withdrawal, really does, I think, speak to how powerful it is affecting that system.
hmm I want to talk about, we've sort of mentioned, we've talked about food addiction, sugar addiction, we've talked about drug addiction, and how all of the stuff taps into core circuitry that's for, natural reward processing. There has to be mechanisms in the brain that allow animals to distinguish different things, to prioritize them, to assign a value to them, and to motivate the animal to seek certain things out. All of that comes with natural constraints based on, limitations in the natural environment that, of course, don't apply to the artificial world that we humans have created. I want to talk about what happens when you sort of block reward processing generally. Are you familiar? So the sort of, I guess you would call them maybe the first generation of weight loss drugs, the rimonabant story. Are you familiar with that?
Oh gosh, it's been a while. I remember reading about this, but it's been a while since I've looked at that literature.
Yeah. So basically, the story there was this is a cannabinoid CB1 receptor antagonist. So, right, cannabinoids give you the munchies. Everyone is sort of familiar with that. It's an antagonist of that receptor, and it was approved as a weight loss drug in Europe in the early 2000s. So you can think of it as like Ozempic version
Hmm.
1.0 or something. And people did lose weight. It was very effective. People started taking it. They started losing weight. They were eating less. But then it was pulled from the market. And the reason for that is that people had a lot of psychiatric side effects, basically
Yeah,
depression, suicidal ideation, and things like that. And sort of the flip side of some of the things we're talking about is, yeah, you can have too much reward and it can spill over into addiction. But
right,
also, if you sort of block this whole reward processing system, it can spill over into things like depression
right.
and anhedonia and things like that. Is there anything like that you've done or anything you want to say there about sort of the flip side of this, taking down the reward signals too far as opposed to boosting them too far?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we talk about doing it pharmacologically, then yeah, like the Ramanabad story, or even like, some of the modern day weight loss drugs that, reduce people's desire to eat. I often question, and I know there's ongoing studies looking at this, is it reducing their desire to have sex? Is it reducing their desire to, go shopping, or,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
other behaviors that are operating on that same reward system? So I do think when we look at this from a pharmacological standpoint, like, yeah, that is a very real concern. Um, but I think my personal viewpoint is that we should be trying to look at this from the standpoint of how can we change our food environment to make less sugar available, in the sense that it's not in all of these different products all the time. I don't think we really run the risk of like having it go the other way when it comes to doing it naturally like that by just ingesting less sugar. But I do think that, we need to keep in mind that, this reward system, like you said, there isn't like a cocaine reward system or a sugar reward system or, sexual behavior reward system. It's just one reward system. And so, other aspects of our life are dependent on that system as well. And I think that's why, we talk about like polysubstance abuse. And when
mm-hmm.
we talk about, this link between, when people are in the throes of addiction to drugs or alcohol, they're struggling with their mental health often. It's because many of these things are connected in terms of the reward system and how it's being activated.
Mm-hmm. And is what you alluded to there a moment ago that like with Ozempic, it's the new version of weight loss drugs that we have. They're GLP-1 drugs. They're causing people to eat less, but people are also well, it's kind of interesting the way things are being looked at and reported because people are saying, it might help people with alcoholism and these
Yeah.
addictions. And that makes sense to me if it's tapping into this reward circuitry. But I wonder if they're also just not looking at what we might just call natural healthy forms of reward that might also be getting messed with here.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, anything that's going to cut back on your desire, I think that's the key word. It's one thing if people who use these drugs, don't have an appetite because they're nauseous, right? That's a
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
different type of, okay, appetitive behavior, right? Like
Yeah.
nausea-induced appetite suppression is very different than I have no desire to eat anything that
I have
is.
less than desire to seek rewards of any kind.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So I think it's an interesting question. Scientifically, I'm not quite sure that it's been explored, but I know that, yeah, there's a lot of interest in, looking at these GLP-1 drugs to see, if they can help with alcohol cravings. And there's been anecdotal reports of that actually happening where people will say, I don't want to drink anymore because I'm taking this drug and suddenly I have no desire for alcohol.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the best case scenario here is it helps people lose weight and it helps people kick these other addictions. I guess the doomsday scenario here is that the drug companies will naturally look for those outcomes first and strongest. And to the extent there are knock-on effects where people start getting depressed and having psychiatric issues, we won't probably know until a number of
Yeah.
people start having those effects and then reporting them. We're not going to know because people are going to look for that ahead of time.
Right, exactly. You have to always ask, like, what are the, clinical endpoints that are being measured? And, how many friends do you have? Or how often do you want to, be with your partner or whatever? Is perhaps not something that they're assessing. So you're right. I think it'll be some time before we know the full scope of how those drugs are actually working and what effects they're having.
Is there anything you can say about within the context of the heightened palatability and the addiction stuff, there's also superimposed on that the actual like metabolic effects in cells and tissues throughout the body. Are there important differences between different forms of sugar that we should talk about, like glucose versus fructose? You mentioned briefly earlier that fructose is processed primarily in the liver, unlike glucose, and so the metabolic effects in
Mhm.
those types of tissues can be very different between the two substances. Is there with the types of artificial caloric sweeteners that are the most common, things like the high fructose corn syrups and things like that, they have the palatability that's going to drive the sugar cravings and things like that. Are they also having based on their composition, um, especially detrimental metabolic effects on top of this sort of addiction component?
Yeah, so I think that the fructose piece is an important part to look at because even though, when we look at sucrose, for example, sucrose is glucose and fructose put
Mm-hmm.
together in a dimer, and there's a bond holding them together, and that bond is dissolved, and then we get glucose and we get fructose, and the fructose does its thing and the glucose does its thing. And then we have some other sweeteners, like you mentioned, high fructose corn syrup, which is similar to sucrose in that it contains glucose and fructose, but it's not proportionate. So sucrose is 50-50. It's one sugar
Yep, because they're
molecule that
physically bound one to one.
physically bound one to one, whereas high fructose corn syrup is not. It's just fructose and glucose put together. And another issue with high fructose corn syrup is that it is often the 55 version is used. So that basically means it's 55% fructose and the rest is glucose. There's other versions of it that are used in baking and confectionery that are up to, high fructose corn syrup 75 or maybe even higher, where it's 75% fructose
Mm-hmm.
and then 25 glucose. And so that basically means you're getting more fructose in your body. But even if we look at just high fructose corn syrup in and of itself, and let's just say, it was 50% fructose and 50% glucose. When that fructose gets in our body, it's metabolized very differently than, like you mentioned, about glucose. So the fructose is metabolized by the liver. And what ends up happening over time is that the isolate cells in the liver, excuse me, the cells in the liver essentially can have fat that gets stored inside of the liver. And this is directly related to the fructose consumption, excess fructose consumption, I should say. And so our liver's ability to basically process all that fructose is impaired and it ends up getting stored as fat. And, it used to be the case that it was called fatty liver disease, and it was something that you would only see in somebody who was like a 50-year-old alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're seeing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It was a disease that had to be named and created to deal with this fructose-induced situation that we're seeing because kids are experiencing this. There's kids that are developing fatty liver disease, and it's not because they're consuming alcohol, it's because they're consuming all these foods with excess amounts of fructose that get into their body via sucrose or other sweeteners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so even though alcohol and fructose are not the same thing, obviously, at a high level, at least, we can think of them similarly with respect to the liver because they both have to go through the liver to be, essentially detoxed.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that to me it's concerning because I like to look at things again, this is a long game that we're playing here in terms of, people aren't going to die from having, one cupcake today. But if we're raising a generation of children on all of this sugar, we're basically walking them into adulthood, perhaps with impaired livers to begin with, from a diet rich in
Mm-hmm.
all this
Yeah.
fructose.
And then they start drinking alcohol and then they
Then
start
they start
doing
drinking
adult stuff.
alcohol. Yeah. Are we going to see like people getting cirrhosis of the liver from drinking a couple glasses of wine now and then? So again, it's, I think, important to think about, what are the effects that we're doing when children are younger, or what are the effects of what our diet is doing to us having on, other aspects of our health that we might, engage later on.
Hmm. Is there so when we think about not just the raw sugar content or the high fructose sugar content, but the full food matrix and the level of work required to consume something. You mentioned, it's a big deal whether or not something has fiber versus no fiber. It's matters whether or not you have to like get something and then chew it versus just drink it. When it comes to things like beverages, like sodas, they not only
Yeah.
have high sugar content, but it's liquid, completely devoid of sugar. Are those types of things some of the worst offenders when it comes to sugar intake?
Oh, absolutely. There was a paper that came out of Harvard from Frank Yu's lab a few years ago that showed really for the first time that consumption of sugar sweetened beverages and also artificially sweetened beverages was directly linked to cardiovascular disease and increased mortality. And it was the drinks. It's, yes, consuming food certainly doesn't help that when it's high in sugar, but the drinking of these beverages really can be detrimental to our health. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. One, you can get a large amount of sugar in a small amount of time. You just have to swallow it. You don't have to, sit there and chew it. This is why I'm not a big fan of smoothies. Juices, I'm not a big fan of for obvious reasons because you're taking out all the fiber. You're just basically like, you know, keeping the sugar and you're getting rid of a lot of the good nutrients. But smoothies are, much, much easier to consume. And that's why I guess people are attracted to them, right? Because, yeah, I don't have time to, eat all this berries and vegetables in the morning. So I'm going to put it in a smoothie and I'll just drink it. That's great. But when you see people making a smoothie with, four bananas in it and, three apples and,
Yeah.
a
And
pint of
tequila
strawberry,
sometimes.
yeah, and tequila, it would take you, you wouldn't even be able to sit there and eat all that fruit. You
Right,
would
right.
be tired of it. So, the thing about beverages is that they are almost like invisible calories.
Hmm.
Your body doesn't register the calories in a beverage. Like if you think about it, have you ever drank something like, a can of soda or beverage like that and been like, oh, I'm full? But if
Yeah.
you have equal number of calories in a solid food, you will be full.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
there's been lots of studies that have compared this and looked at, this difference that we experience when we consume something in liquid form versus solid form. It's
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, and I think this is again where I think the analogy with drug addiction comes in, and what I mean here is that the form factor and the rate of absorption are very important for determining the reinforcing value that something has. So a classic example would be snorted powdered cocaine versus inhaled crack cocaine. They're
Mhm.
essentially both the same thing at the end of the day, but one of them is going to hit your bloodstream much more quickly and circulate faster than the other.
Right, exactly. And when you're chewing food, you have to digest it. There's going to be a slow release of, these different components of the food as your body breaks it down, as your digestive system kicks it in and does what it does to, extract the nutrients from the food. Whereas that is really sped up when we talk about drinking something.
Hmm.
And so the effects that you experience, when people have these sugar sweetened beverages are, very, very different than if they're going to be eating something that contains sugar. And that's part of the reason why, because of that route of administration.
Hmm. How much do you know about the engineering of processed foods and how much conscious engineering goes into that?
Well, there's certainly a lot of consciousness that goes into it because it's a business and, people want to make sure that they're doing their research to make sure that whatever product they're developing is going to be successful. And I think that, people are, I guess, a bit naive if they think that the food companies care if the food is healthy or not. That's not their job, to be honest. I mean, their job is to make food and sell it. It's not like it says this is healthy food. They're not claiming it's healthy food. They never said it was. So, why should they have to abide by that
Hmm.
rule?
Hmm.
So I think that there is a lot that goes into it. Many food companies hire, food scientists that basically their job is to figure out how to make these foods more desirable, how to make them smell a certain way, how to, even down to the packaging, like when you open the package, the sound that it makes, because you have to keep in mind, this is all preconditioning. We come to associate that sound with the eventual taste of the food product. And after those pairings have been made a few times, we very quickly learn that that sound is associated with that delicious taste. So it's going to release dopamine just by having the sound. That's
Hmm.
why the advertisements and the way in which the packages are, kind of portrayed on a shelf, that's also important too, because it serves as a way to kind of prime us to then want to get that substance because we recall the taste.
Hmm.
So there's a lot that goes into it, even beyond what the actual food tastes like, to make these things desirable so that people will continue to buy them.
Hmm. If someone, has been consuming a lot of sugar for a long time and, they're effectively addicted to sugar, I would imagine there are adaptations, physiological adaptations that are going to distinguish them from other people. The level of sweetness receptors in the tongue is probably different, for example. If someone is trying to kick a sugar addiction or something like this, is this possible? How much time does it take? Does your tongue readapt? Can you sort of stop consuming sugars and then eventually come to enjoy the lesser amount of sweetness you get from eating a physical orange rather than a glass of Sunny Delight or something like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wrote a lot about this in my book Sugarless that is out now. It's coming out in paperback in January. And one of the things that I think people are intimidated by is this whole idea of, oh, I'll never be able to, find joy in food again, right? And I think this happens with people who struggle with alcoholism. A lot of times, one of the barriers for them giving up alcohol is that they've become so dependent on alcohol to just help them get through their day. And so they can't imagine life without it. And I think that's something that happens a lot of times when people are kind of struggling with sugar addiction is, I can't imagine being happy or satisfied or feeling good not having sugar. And physiologically, our body completely changes because when you wean yourself off of the processed food and the added sugar, what ends up happening is that, yes, your taste receptors are going to change. You're also going to see that the connections in your brain in terms of, the desires and the cravings are going to become easier and more manageable because it's again all about learning and learning theory. We're putting distance between the stimulus and the reinforcer. And if you're not providing the reinforcer, even when you get the stimulus, over time the learning is going to break down and you're not going to, have those strong cravings like you had in the past. So that I think is important to keep in mind. It's just a matter of getting there. And people often will say, well, how long does it take? It really depends on the individual, like how much sugar they've been consuming, and also for how long. I mean, there's a lot of people who have been consuming lots of added sugar for a very long time. So it can take a while in cases like that. But what I really advocate is that people do not a cold turkey approach because I don't think that that really works. I know people typically, when we talk about addiction, think, oh, well, if someone's addicted to cocaine, you don't say, oh, just do a little less cocaine. You say, no, you got to stop doing all cocaine and just get off of it.
Hmm. But
But
the cocaine isn't in everything.
the cocaine isn't in everything. Yeah. And, there's like, it's pretty clear, like cocaine is cocaine. I know where I'm getting it. Um, but there's like shades of gray with lots of these different foods that are out there where maybe it's got a little sugar in it, but that's okay if I'm not having tons of sugar from other things that I'm eating. So I think it's important to do more of a stepwise approach and
Hmm.
focus on beverages. I think that should be the number one goal right off the bat, is to reduce the amount of sugar in beverages that people are consuming, and then kind of go from there and just work to reduce it and have less and less of it. And that again, it's going to have effects that are going to be positive for people's health no matter what, even by just reducing it little bits at
Hmm.
a time.
Hmm. I think at this point, in my personal view, anyone who's paying attention understands that our food environment is engineered and it's basically toxic and it's filled
Yeah.
with lots of garbage. And people will argue details, and some people will blame the sugar more or the seed oils more or the food dyes, this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of stuff we could talk about. But this is the food environment we're in. To what extent do you think changes can be made to the food environment versus to what extent do you think it's really just going to be up to people to regulate their relationship with this environment because it's not certainly not going to go away entirely anytime soon.
Yeah, it's a difficult question because it kind of goes back to how I got interested in this. Like the issue back in the year 2000, 2001 was obesity. And well, is it just up to people to just say no to food and not eat in excess? And that's going to be the cure for obesity. And kind of again going back to the initial query I had, which was, well, what if the food's addictive? When it's
Mm-hmm.
addictive, then people lose control and they don't really have that rational aspect to their decision making like people would if they weren't
Mm-hmm.
addicted.
Yeah, I mean, by definition, addiction is a diminishment in willpower.
Exactly, exactly. And so I think, yes, I think it's going to take people to stand up and say, you know what, we're demanding that these foods we're not going to buy them, right? Right. That certainly would be one way to deal with it. But if then on the other side we're saying, okay, well, these foods are addictive, you know, it's not going to be quite so easy.
Can you do that enough to actually move the needle?
Yeah, and I think that, a lot of, fortunately and unfortunately, but fortunately, a lot of the people who have been speaking out about this and the people who can really make a change are going to be the people who aren't struggling with food addiction or who aren't struggling, who kind of are able to then say, you know what, we're just not going to buy that stuff. And hopefully we can get more people to fall on that side of the fence so that, then these products just won't be demanded by consumers. But again, I think, it's a little bit short-sighted because most people in this country are obese or overweight. And it's most likely related to their access to food. And they're more likely to be consuming food if they're living in food deserts, that's going to be highly processed foods because that's all that's available to them. So I think, it's a complicated issue, but I do think that, it's going to have to come from people to kind of speak up and to demand some changes. But I also think that we need to at some point have some regulations in place. I mean, you could put as much sugar as you want. I mean, there's nothing, as long as it's on the GRAS list, so generally recognized as safe ingredients, you can put whatever you want together and concoct any type of food product that you like,
Mm-hmm.
and no one can tell you not to,
Mm-hmm.
as long as the ingredients are safe. But there's no limits on, how much sugar, how much dye, all these other things that are coming up as, we're finding to be detrimental to health. There's a license by the food companies to basically just do whatever they want. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that needs to change.
And I really don't know a whole lot about this, but that generally recognized as safe designation, where does that come from and how is it set? Because I've heard this before, but I've never really looked into it. It sounds like you shouldn't, generally recognized as safe there's a really low bar there.
Oh yeah, and it's you're basically innocent till proven guilty, right? So, and I have to see if this is the case for the food industry, but I know for the dietary supplement industry, it's the case where companies can now like self-proclaim ingredients as being grass.
Hmm.
So you could create something in their
By
lab.
default,
Yeah, and oh, it's
yeah,
grass. Yeah, it's fine. Until like something bad happens and they realize, oh wait, never mind, it's not.
it hasn't been recognized as toxic yet.
Yes, and
Yeah.
it's interesting if you look at what's happening in the UK. So the United Kingdom has much more stringent procedures in place when it comes to what can and can't be in their food. Many products that are generally recognized as safe here are not allowed in the food companies to be produced and sold in the UK. And so I think, I know that we're like on different parts of the world and in different spaces in the planet, but we're still humans, and there's no reason to think that, what's not safe for them is going to be safe for us, right? So again, it's complicated, but I do think there could be more done there to tighten that up because it is a bit of the wild, wild west when it comes to what goes in these things.
Mm-hmm. What are you working on in the lab these days as it relates to any of this stuff? What are some of the outstanding questions when it comes to things like sugar, either on the addiction side or the metabolic health side?
Yeah, great question. So I've become a lot more interested. in sort of the genesis of sugar addiction. And, I think this has kind of come out of interest in early life nutrition. So the first 1,000 days. So looking at what's consumed during pregnancy up to age 2 years of after birth, and kind of seeing how that relates to health outcomes later in life, mental health and physical health. And there's been a lot of work that's been looking at the role of that early life nutrition window and outcomes related to immune system health, outcomes related to cognitive abilities, and also outcomes just related to various different medical complications. So that's where I've been kind of thinking and focusing these days, is this sort of early life component. And also, just still trying to better understand. And it's getting a little bit more complicated as our food environment is getting so much more complex. Like as time goes on, I mean, there's new ingredients popping up all the time. There's new sweeteners that are appearing, and it's almost like these things are appearing and being widely used before we have had a chance to sit down and like assess, like, okay, is this good for us to use, and are there long-term effects? And what happens when you combine these things? That's the other thing. I mean, if you look at a lot of the different products that are out there, to get around the requirement now where food companies have to disclose the amount of added sugar, you're seeing not only is there added sugar in products because they have to declare that on the label in terms of how many grams of added sugar, but they're also, to keep that number lower, just because people don't like to see that number that high, there's like other artificial sweeteners that are added. There's other non-nutritive sweeteners that are added. So there could be 4 or 5 different types of sweetener in one product
And it
now.
looks like it's with low added sugar.
Right. But it's just that, it's probably actually, when that first came to be that the companies were required to disclose that, I think everyone thought that was going to be great because that would mean that companies would have to reduce how sweet the products were. But I think it backfired. If
Hmm.
anything, the products are more sweet now because they're adding just all these different alternative sweeteners to the mix as well, in addition to added sugar.
Hmm. And then you mentioned your book earlier. Do you want to mention that again and just kind of point people to where they can read more about your work in general?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, my new book, Sugarless, is about the research on sugar addiction, really kind of the history of it, and really is great for anyone who's just interested in learning more about sugar and how it affects not only your physical health, but also mental health. And kind of just understanding this landscape of our food environment and how sugar fits into that. And also, if you're struggling with cutting back on it or want to cut back on it, how you can basically use what we know from the science to help to reduce your dependence on sugar. And you can get that anywhere books are sold, Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, all the regular places. And if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing, you can check out my website. It's drnicoleavena.com. And you can also find me on social at Dr. Nicole Avena.
Hmm. And just one final question, I guess. How what kind of heuristics do you use to regulate your own exposure to sweetness? Are you just trying to minimize added sugars and artificially sweetened foods of any kind? Are you moderating at all your consumption of whole fruits, or like where do you sort of regulate yourself?
Yeah, so I don't moderate my consumption of whole fruits. I think it's because I really don't eat much added sugar. And when I do, like for example, for breakfast, I had a couple slices of an apple, and I was satisfied. It got to be too sweet for me because, I don't eat much sugar. So for somebody like me, having just a couple slices of apple is going to satisfy whatever, tolerability I have for sweetness. It started to become aversive. But somebody who is eating, Cheerios and all these other things that have lots of added sugar in them, they're probably not going to find that apple to be, super sweet, so they could eat a lot of it. I don't think that the problems we have right now in terms of the poor health in the United States and in many other countries are related to people eating too much fruit. I really think that's the least of our problems. But I do think that, again, it just leads to this excess consumption of everything that comes from this background of all this ultra processed food with added sugar in it. So yeah, I don't really I just try my best to not eat processed food and to not eat, stuff that has a lot of added sugar. But hey, if I want to have cookies and we're baking cookies, I'll bake cookies. But I just think that, it's for me, I know too much. And so I have to do this. But, it takes effort, it takes time to prepare food and to, cook a lot of things. But I enjoy doing that. And I think that, for me, that's just what I like to do. And I think that's my way of protecting my health. And I think, if more people got on board with kind of slowing down and just taking the time to prepare stuff yourself so that you know what's actually in it, it really matters now because even we're hearing a lot about all these food recalls and the bacteria, listeria breakouts and things like that. So I think that keeping it closer to home is the best way because you know what's in it and you have more control. If you do want to make cookies and add sugar, you get to control how much sugar you add. So you don't have that option when you buy them in the grocery store.
All right, Dr. Nicole Avena, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.